The Spotlight, shining a light on podcasts and videos that have caught our attention.
Hi and welcome to The Spotlight. My name is Jen Spiker and today I'll share the conclusion of a video from the recent Answers in Genesis Living in Babylon Australian tour. Over 10 days, Ken Ham and Martyn Iles visited 4 Australian capital cities, sharing a series of messages suggesting that we live in a modern-day equivalent of Babylon. Today, we'll hear the conclusion of Martyn Iles' first message to a capacity crowd in Adelaide, pointing out why Babylon is more relevant now than ever.
The Spotlight with Jen Spiker.
You know, we instinctively pray for Christians under persecution. I think we need to pray for Christians under seduction. It's interesting, I met with a guy, the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Sydney. Pardon me, Your Grace. I met with him in Sydney, in Western Sydney, some time ago, and he had actually come from Iraq, and he was the Archbishop of Mosul in Iraq. And he was one of the last people out of Mosul when ISIS came in. He'd seen people die, all sorts of shocking things. And he'd come to Sydney as a refugee under the program that was in place at the time, became the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Sydney. I think that's an Orthodox church. I think that's the one that's actually Orthodox. Someone might correct me. But anyway, even though it's called Catholic. Anyway, I was talking to him and I said, well, out of interest, what was better for you, Mosul or Sydney? And before the words were even out of my mouth, he said Mosul. I said, oh, why? He said, well, in Mosul the choice was very easy. Live or die. He said, in Sydney, you people have a third option. Compromise. And you know, there's a sense in which metaphorically we compromise because we're not prepared to die. We're not prepared to lose. We're not prepared to die to ourselves. Die to what's around us and live for Christ. And you know, these men, they faced what they faced, I believe, of such epic magnitude, because we're probably never going to have to face that. And if they can do it by the power of God, so can we deal with our situation. Let me get into the reply. I'm going to be over time here. Sorry, whoever's monitoring the time. But I need to land the plane. I want you to note what they did, their decision. It says, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. In other words, God will answer you. He'll provide his own answer. In other words, they've committed themselves entirely to God's hands. And it's interesting, you might say to yourself, I could never do that. I could never go through that trial. I could never deal with that cost. You must never judge what you could be able to do under trial based on who you are today. Because if you do right, God will help you. If you are one man or woman doing right in the face of 1,000, the fourth man will join you in the fire. Don't ever judge your ability based on who you are now. They committed themselves to God, and that's what we must do as well. And it's interesting, when you do the right thing and you leave the consequences with God, they're pretty much never what you expect. You read through Daniel, every Babylon choice had a consequence that was not what you would expect at all. And I'll tell you, in this particular instance, it wasn't what they expected, because they said to Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. You think, praise God, yes, he can. But then they say, but if not, and that's extraordinary, we will not bow. And it shows, by the way, they weren't loving God for the perks. They weren't loving God for what he gave them. They were loving God for God's own sake. But anyway, it seems like they had 2 ideas in their head, that they'd be delivered from the furnace or they would die. Neither of those things happened. The unexpected outcome was that they were delivered in the furnace. And that was the extraordinary twist. And I want to leave us with a consideration of that. God actually saved them in the fire. And we must realize that being a Christian, following Christ, is not going to save us from the fires all the time. But sometimes, for his own reason, he needs us to go into the fire. that he might deliver us there, and the lesson from the passage in the whole book of Daniel is that he might do his most powerful work in that moment. A work towards you and in you, and a work towards Babylon and for his kingdom in Babylon. God works in fires. He just needs people to stand in them. He needs people who will say, I will not bow. He needs people to say, God might deliver me, he might not, or something else might happen. And usually it's the something else. And these guys, they took a stand in that fire. And it's interesting when Nebuchadnezzar looks in there. Yes, he sees the fourth man, and we've dealt with that. Christ is with them in the fire. And Jesus says, behold, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the earth. Right? So it's no surprise. But also, he looks in there and he says, I see them unbound. Is that a weird observation? Why are they unbound? I hope this isn't fanciful. I don't think it is. These guys are free. Why would we not go into the fire? We wouldn't go into the fire because of the things that hold us to this world. Because of the things that bind us to this world. All those things of reputation and standing and popularity and blah, 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 blah. You fill in the blank in your own life. Whatever it is that would hold you. I tell you what, when you trust Christ in the fires, you're released from them. You're freed from them. And that is a work that he will do in you for your good, more than so many others. And we need people who are freed from the cords of this world that bind them so that they might serve God wholeheartedly. The Apostle Paul talks about famine, he talks about tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, and sword. And then he says, in all these things, we are more than conquerors. Not from all these things, God will always save us. No, in all these things. And that's the secret to a life in Babylon. The final secret is this. And I've seen this in my own experience, actually. There's so many things you read in Daniel and you think, wow, that is so true. It's the fires, actually, when God does some of his most powerful work in this culture, in this world. It is the testimony that emanates from God's people under fire, in challenge, in trouble, that saves souls, that reaches a pagan world with the gospel. What happened with Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, first of all, he published a decree throughout the whole land, so these guys become world famous for what happened. I mean, the testimony goes around the world. It's like primetime television for a few nights. Everyone knows about it. Everyone knows about the God who delivered. No other God can deliver like this. What a testimony. A testimony that follows Daniel throughout the rest of the book, by the way. Everyone knows. Oh, get Daniel. You need him. Oh, Daniel's righteous. Let's go after him. All that kind of thing. You want a testimony? Stand in the fires. But also, Nebuchadnezzar is ultimately converted. Isn't that extraordinary? This man, this is the second chapter of sort of 3 chapters of God working on him. And God was looking for someone who he could use. And he got Daniel in chapter 2. And he got these 3 in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, just to finish the job, God himself humbles him with lycanthropy. And he thinks he's got the mind of a beast. And he goes mad for a time. And chapter 4 of Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. A megalomaniac, a despot, a killer. And you know what? We'll meet him in heaven. Isn't it amazing? I mean, what did the Apostle Paul say? Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I'm chief. Well, he's got competition with Nebuchadnezzar, that's for sure. But God saved him. Manasseh, Paul, you and me, whoever we are. We must be challenged by this. We must be. The context in which we're called to serve God has changed. We must come to terms with that. And the call on us in this context goes as no less than this. Will you stand with the fourth man in the fires? And you think you can't do that. Of course you can't, but he can. And these men inspire us that in Babylon God has a great work for us to do. And his kingdom will advance if we're ready to do that work and stand it with Christ instead of bowing to idols. And when you belong to Jesus Christ, when he is truly Lord and King in your heart, and by the way, that was the secret. Nebuchadnezzar could conquer everything except their hearts. Couldn't get in there. That's what made him so angry. Couldn't change them. That was another king was in there, bigger than Nebuchadnezzar. But when he is your king, this is the kind of thing you will find yourself doing. I mean, not burning fiery furnaces, but trials. Things that come to you, boldness, courage. And you may be burdened by it, even as we talk about it tonight, but you'll be strangely exhilarated by it. That the God who reigns in heaven and in your heart may use you for eternal things against all odds. And what a legacy these guys had. A converted king, famous for their faith and their fear of God. And if you want anyone to be famous, you want these guys to be famous. A testimony in a light and a dark culture. I believe, by the way, the Magi who come to Jesus from the east, Daniel was chief of the Magi in the east. He was a prophet. How did they know? Well, there's a legacy left that's intergenerational. But more than that, an eternal legacy. Actually, a legacy that comes to us today, and we read the chapter. Look how God used them. But an eternal legacy. Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. And this is Daniel right now tonight. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego right now tonight. He says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Babylon ends, folks, but that doesn't end. You're going in for what Babylon offers you. There'll be a last day when it's all gone. And the lament of Revelation, fallen, fallen, is Babylon the Great. But this goes on forever. When everything we have built here will be gone, what will we have on that day? God's glory and the glory of his servants is eternal. It never ends. And I want to leave us with the thought, will you share in it? Will you share with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the man they saved, by whose work they saved, God saved, Nebuchadnezzar, in that kingdom that will never end, looking back and speaking of the fires and praising God, exhilarated that he was pleased to use little old you and me in a Babylon to advance his course. And I want us to think seriously about that and say to you all, if you have not, turn to the fourth man in the fire. Let him loose your bonds that tie you to other things. Trust him. Serve him. Lose Babylon. Receive eternity. And you can do it tonight.
This is The Spotlight and the conclusion of a message Martyn Iles shared during the recent Answers in Genesis Living in Babylon Australian tour. As Martyn says, Babylon is more relevant now than ever. You can watch Martyn's message in full in the free Vision app. Just tap the Watch tab and scroll to the Living in Babylon Australian tour channel for this and more talks in this series. If you have a favourite podcast or video series that you'd like to hear featured on The Spotlight, click Contact Us at vision.org.au and share the link. I'm Jen Spiker. Join me next time on The Spotlight as I share another podcast or video worth highlighting.
For more great podcasts and videos like the one featured today, check out vision.org.au or the free Vision app.